For centuries, the siren call of the tropics has beckoned a certain breed of medical scientists. Teeming with life and pathogenic microbes, the torrid zone has always borne a heavy weight of disease. But strength and courage also abound in the tropics. From river to rainforest to savanna, remote village to swarming city. Workers in tropical medicine hunt vectors, track illness, and test life-saving treatments, at times risking their lives in the process. The tools of their trade range from a simple net to a syringe to a microscope to a biosafety level 4 lab. Over the years, many workers have been members of the American Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. Founded in 1903 in a Philadelphia meeting house, ASTMH's birth followed America's victory over yellow fever and acquisition of a string of tropical territories. 50 years later, ASTMH's merger with the National Malaria Society produced a seal symbolizing their shared mission. Today, ASTMH is a global organization whose 4,000 members battle tropical scourges from malaria to AIDS. Karl Johnson, one of its past presidents, is a medical virologist who helped to discover Machupo, Hanta, and Ebola virus. When he's not giving input on the design of state-of-the-art biosafety labs or writing a memoir with his wife, Merle, Johnson still enjoys his lifelong passion for fly fishing. But in December 2005, Johnson left his home in New Mexico for Washington, D.C., and ASTMH's largest ever meeting. President Thomas Moniff addressed the assembled crowd.
On behalf of the Awards Committee, it gives me great pleasure to present this year's Walter Reed Medal to Karl Johnson.
Among the many longtime friends in the audience was Barnett Klein, another past president of ASTMH and former chair of tropical medicine at Tulane. Johnson and Klein first met when Klein was still in med school. The next time they crossed paths, Klein was a Peace Corps doctor in South America, and Johnson was zeroing in on the tiny killer he would soon name Machupo. Such are the ties and memories that bind ASTMH members. The following conversation between Johnson and Klein gives just a taste of one career of many in the ongoing fight against tropical disease.
A lot is known about your professional contributions, but not a great deal about your early formative years.
I was the oldest of 3 kids, born to a pair of people who came off of Iowa farms. My dad, oldest of 4, loved all the plants, the apple trees and the this and the that and the other. He hated slopping the pigs, milking the cows. He ran off and he got a PhD in botany. So he wasn't got anything to do with animals. And got a job at Rutgers University. I was 3 months old in a basket when they carried me there. This is 1929, and it was just a matter of maybe 2 or 3 months before the infamous crash of the stock market of 1929. My dad, though, had a job. He was on tenure track, as they say. And I was raised then in what you would say really today was the country.
The 3 Johnson kids loved their periodic visits to their grandfather's farm, an enthusiasm their college professor dad did not share. A neighbor introduced Karl to fly fishing, a sport which became a lifelong passion. When school bells tolled, Karl was a good, if not highly motivated student. In high school, the baseball diamond was more to his liking than the classroom. By high school graduation, he had decided to strike out on his own, rather than attend Rutgers as the son of a faculty member.
My parents put me on a Greyhound bus with a trunk, and I went off to Oberlin College. I started out washing the pots and pans in one of the dorm kitchens, and the next year became a waiter, and the next year became a dorm counselor. I had a wonderful time at Oberlin. This was a school that was the first coeducational college in the country. There were no fraternities, and you were not allowed to have a car. So we didn't have any of the sort of social strata based upon, how wealthy and prominent your parents were. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I'd studied science, but I didn't have a very clear idea. I enjoyed much more the girls at Oberlin and playing baseball and basketball.
1948. Johnson is in his junior year at Oberlin when the Korean War breaks out. The long arm of the draft starts plucking his male classmates. Then MacArthur crosses the Yellow River and China enters the war. Yearning to make a meaningful contribution, Johnson decides to become a pre-med. In December 1950, one semester away from graduating Phi Beta Kappa from Oberlin, a conversation at the University of Rochester School of Medicine launches a new chapter of his life.
I sat down with the dean at Christmas vacation. He was George Hoyt Whipple, a Nobel laureate in his 70s, who had been the founder of the medical school. He was sitting on a stool in the path lab with a brown coat on, not a white coat, looking down an ancient microscope. And we sat and we talked about pheasant hunting and trout fishing and odds and ends like that. And I went away thinking, no question, if they'll have me, that's where I'm going. And that happened.
Well, here you are in medical school. Now, how did you get hooked on viruses? Where did that start?
Microbiology was a course in second year. And the professor had only come, I think, 2 years previously. He was very young, chairman of the department named Herbert Morgan. And Herb Morgan was a tremendous teacher. And he had been a student of John Enders, who in turn was a Nobel laureate for his work on poliovirus. Well, I just was fascinated. There also was a new textbook, the first one in which experts in the field wrote chapters. I thoroughly enjoyed reading that stuff.
With internship and residency under his belt, Johnson finally has the opportunity to join the Public Health Service and explore his ever-growing fascination with viruses at the National Institutes of Health.
I got into NIH to do my 2 years military service and never left. My professor of medicine in Rochester tried 2 years in a row to get me back to be the chief resident and finish my board requirements in internal medicine.
So this was the turning point that
Oh,
led
yeah.
you to
Absolutely,
a
the
career
turning
in science.
point. Yeah,
rather
because things
than-
were going so well. I was
Yeah.
working with a tremendous group, arguably, perhaps in terms of its depth and breadth, the best virus group in the country. Really prominent people. Every one of them were or became members of the National Academy of Science. And we didn't have to teach students. We didn't have to apply for grants. All we had to do is pick up the telephone. I'll have 100 baby mice, please. I'll need 40 tissue cultures of this kind by next Wednesday, thank you. And there they appeared. What we had to do was think and do experiments and write. Well, pretty darn productive.
Johnson spent the next 3.5 years investigating respiratory viruses. Among his discoveries, isolating and naming type 4 parainfluenza virus, showing that an enteric virus related to polio also causes respiratory disease, and isolating and naming 5 of the first 9 rhinoviruses. Then one day, his NIH boss came to him with an offer he thought Johnson couldn't refuse.
He said, we've just gotten $4 million from Congress. In 1962, $4 million was a lot of money. And he said, you're going to be the project director. You're going to develop the common cold vaccine. And I looked at him and I went home and I remember thinking about that and pacing out on the street that night saying to myself, how in the hell am I going to ever put 50 viruses in a bottle? Because by now there were 50 completely different strains of these rhinoviruses that cause common cold. I don't think so. And I remembered that I had seen the year before a notice on a bulletin board about somebody, a scientist, a virologist, wanted to go to the Panama Canal Zone.
It was Dr. Alexis Shelikov who had posted that want ad for a virologist to join a group of tropical biologists at the Middle America Research Unit, MARU for short, in the Panama Canal Zone. Johnson tracked him down at the NIH campus in Bethesda.
And I said to Alex, you still got that job open to run the virus section in this place? And he said, yeah. And he said, I'll tell you what, if you're willing to consider it, and seriously, he says, we can get on a plane, I'll take you down there, we'll spend a week in Panama. And you can look at everything, you can meet all the people, you can make up your own mind.
The MARU facility was based in Balboa, a town perched on the Pacific side of the Isthmus of Panama and next door to Panama City. For Johnson, the 2,200-mile journey brought him to another world and a new life.
And so right away we were in the town and looking around and all the rest of it. I couldn't understand what people were saying, but you could see that Latin life was really full of energy. The lab I thought wasn't bad. It needed this and that and a few things. I finally decided, yeah, I'll go and have a couple of years and maybe, who knows, find something, a serious virus disease to work on where my medical training, in addition to the virology, would be of use. So I went back and told my boss that this is what I was going to do, and he just almost fell out of his chair. He says, you have a great career ahead of you. What the heck's the matter with you? You're going to go down to that Deadwater place. There isn't anybody there, or isn't anything particular to do. You're supposed to sit there and watch and see when the next time yellow fever comes by. God knows you may be dead by then. And he said, if that's what you're going to do, I got to tell you, I'm not promising to take you back when you get bored. I said, I'll risk it, knowing I had in my back pocket a medical degree that I could always find a way to put food on the table. So away I went in September of 1962. I went for 2 years and I stayed 13.
Johnson's first major challenge at MARU was a virulent hemorrhagic fever that had been savaging a remote region of Bolivia for more than 2 years. The illness resembled another hemorrhagic fever in Argentina. But at the time of Johnson's arrival in Panama, it was still unknown if the two scourges were caused by the same agent. Whatever the mystery Bolivian sickness was, the tiny eastern outpost of San Joaquin was its epicenter.
People were getting this disease every day, literally, and 3 or 4 of them a week in a town of 2,000 dying. You know, it was a very solemn, difficult time.
I was going to ask you, there's a lot of ocean and mountain and jungle between Panama City and San Joaquin, Bolivia.
The round trip was 5 days. They flew 150 miles an hour, that was all. You fly the Pacific Ocean to Lima. You go the next day up and land in the highest commercial airport in the world at La Paz, 13,300. And then the third day, you have to go screaming down the other side of the Andes, and you finally are on a almost featureless savanna plain with no humans or anything, and no radio beacons or anything to help the airplanes get to this little village.
The logistical challenges of setting up a field station in San Joaquin were daunting, if not outright impossible. But then a certain global crisis came to the rescue.
A month after I got to Panama was the infamous Cuban Missile Crisis. So all of a sudden, the U.S. State Department, the U.S. military, Defense Department said, oh my God, Che Guevara is going to run wild. He had been saying publicly in writing and in speeches that he was going to make a landing and start revolution in mainland South America. It was a big push to win the hearts and minds of the Bolivians. And we were visited by headquarters of Canal Zone military. What do you guys need? We'll help you. Anyway, but we can't. So I said, well, how about a flight every 2 weeks down and back to this town of San Joaquin, which was the epicenter. And the colonel sent his guy back 2 days later and said, you got it. So I had an airline. And with that airline, I said, boy, I can keep a dry ice chain going. I can get liquid nitrogen, plenty of that in Panama. Instead of going and grabbing samples, we're going to go set up a lab. We're going to live with them, accept whatever the risks were that the people had.
The risks were real. Before the 2-year mission ended, 6 of the team members would go down with the disease, including Johnson himself. One adopted team member who stayed healthy was Rose Navarro, a Peace Corps nurse from Chicago. She used her language skills to rally local people to turn a vacant house into a laboratory.
They did a marvelous job. They're local carpenters, and everything there was done hand. They cut down a tree by hand. They sawed planks by hand. They planed. They did everything. They made the lab furniture for us. Got the place wired up. They only had 4 hours of electricity a day in town, so we had to use a generator for the rest of the time. We managed to get that going. And pretty soon, it took us a week, and we had a laboratory.
Key components were plastic versions of cabinets used in what are today designated Biosafety Level 4 labs, a technology that Johnson pioneered. He had these cabinets custom-made at Fort Detrick, Maryland, fearing that the Bolivian virus might otherwise spread to team members via aerosol. Now that the lab was fully equipped and ready for use, the town celebrated. But the festivities weren't long to last.
That same day, a little boy came in, was brought in from a neighboring ranch, moribund. I mean, he was severely dehydrated. He'd been sick for 8 days, and he died within about 3 hours. And we did an autopsy, and we spent all night until the roosters crowed in the morning, processing tissue organs. The spleen from that little boy caused the baby hamsters, to die about 7 days later, and 1 more week transferring it to make sure we had something that was really growing. We had recovered the virus of Bolivian hemorrhagic fever. In about 19 days from the time that we landed this plane with all the gear, 2 tons of gear, and put it there. Yeah.
Nearly a year later, sophisticated testing answered the final question regarding the origins of the Bolivian virus.
We found out that this virus was different from the virus from Argentina. Related, yes, by the test A, let's call it, but by the neutralizing test, very distinct. That meant we had a new virus.
How did you name that virus?
Well, and whoever gets the new virus has a chance to name it. And I decided I didn't want to name it for the town, because that might give the town a very bad, kind of reputation. This is the town where the deadly virus is. So what I chose instead was the little river that runs by the town about half a mile away, and it's called the Machupo River. So Machupo virus it was, Machupo virus it is to this day.
Summer 1963. At this point, they have a new virus, and it has a name. But Machupo is still doing its deadly work in and around San Joaquin. A lot more detective work remains to be done before the killer is brought under control.
We were by then looking hard for what's the vector, where is this thing in nature, how do people get it? Up to that point, more than 90% of all the human disease was in the south part of the town. The people in the north weren't getting sick. We thought mosquitoes wouldn't work because if it was mosquitoes, the whole town would get it. They fly around. We began to take pieces of canvas and drag the ground and the bushes and things looking for mites and ticks.
I remember when I was there watching that process.
The 3 of us who got sick were doing that out of the whole team
Tell
for the
me
10
more.
days prior to getting
Tell
ill.
me more about that. That's no small thing, the 3 of you becoming ill.
Well,
And what happened?
Mackenzie and Ángel Munoz, one of our technicians, both admitted that they had had for almost a day and a half fever, low back pain. They had red eyes. They were beginning to get the sensitive skin, a hypersensitivity of skin. All of these things very typical. The next day I was really feeling low and my white count was beginning to go down.
Epidemiologist Ron Mackenzie's fever broke in a week, while Ángel Munoz went into shock and nearly died. Johnson himself has no recollection of his darkest days, except for waking up in the hospital with Dr. Patricia Webb, by that time his fiancée, at his side. Webb, plus a Special Forces sergeant and his wife, were the last to fall ill. All 6 survived with one added grace: complete immunity to the disease. But when they returned to San Joaquin, the same implacable challenges still faced them. Then, in late 1963, their dogged detective work finally paid off. At long last, they had a prime suspect in their sights.
There was a mouse in this town that, a wild mouse, that had moved into the town from outside. We found the mouse all through the town, and somebody brought us one that was convulsing and bleeding. And we thought, oh, this is pretty good. Hemorrhagic fever reservoir, maybe. One night in the cantina, drinking beer and listening to guitar music, Mackenzie found the man who lived right across the street from our lab, who turned out to have been the index case, as near as we can tell, of the disease. In 1959, he had this disease. The government had come out in 1961, and they thought it was a form of typhus, a rickettsial disease, and they thought it was transmitted by mice. So they gave the town batches of warfarin, an anticoagulant drug, which is used to kill rodents. Here we are in 1963. He's still using warfarin around his house, and it turned out that the bleeding mouse that had been brought in, that was virus positive, came from his house. So I said to myself, oh my God, this mouse was infected, but maybe, you know, the infection had nothing to do with the so-called illness. Senior people back in the U.S. didn't want to believe it either. There has to be an arthropod, a tick or a mite or a mosquito or something, to be a vector to get these things from nature to man. After all, Walter Reed had figured it out, you know, with the mosquito for yellow fever, and that's how these diseases work. Not in this case.
Then an intriguing finding in the Panama lab cast further doubt on the vector hypothesis.
We found out that if we inoculated baby hamsters, the mother hamster usually ate one or more of the babies about a day before we could tell they were sick. And we put some of the mamas aside, and after 30 days we got blood samples, tested them, they were all infected. So Mackenzie set up this experiment where we're going to inoculate adult hamsters and then take serial samples of blood and urine. And lo and behold, beginning about a week after infection, the urines began to be positive. And they kept saying positive and positive and positive. Pretty soon it was pretty clear that the hamster suffered a chronic infection with virus in the urine from this virus. Now, there was no reason to think because that was the case for a hamster, it was going to happen with the Bolivian mouse. But as soon as we saw that, we said to ourselves, you know, if it should turn out that that's the thing, then all the data we have makes sense. You can't get it from the mites. It must have just come into the town, and it's slowly spreading through the mouse. That's why south is positive and north is not. Next year, maybe north will be. Turned out it was. And so we got kind of excited, and we said, okay, we're going to take a chance. We're going to do a rodent control program. And when we finally set it up, and we finally ran it, where we killed the mice in one half of the town and not the other half for a while, after 2 weeks, bang, no more new cases in that half. I moved the traps, added traps to the other side of the town, 2 more weeks. End of epidemic that had lasted more than 18 months. It was just the chronic urination of these infected mice, and people disturbing the ground, their homes, making dust, and maybe sometimes consuming food left out, and the mice are urinating on it. That was the answer to that.
In 1964, Johnson is named director of the entire Maru operation. It soon becomes a magnet for some of the best and the brightest in tropical medicine research, which is good, because major challenges lie ahead. In 1969, Johnson's team is severely tested by Venezuelan equine encephalitis virus, a mosquito-borne pathogen that kills both horses and humans. Maru scientists gather specimens in Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, and Panama. A talented young physician named Nathaniel Young creates a map which shows antigenic variation from region to region. Then Maru receives alarming news from Guatemala and Nicaragua. A highly virulent strain has surfaced, and it is on the move.
It's not like any previously known Central American virus. So again, we were involved in a groundbreaking, a first ever sort of epizootic epidemic. And the questions were, what are the mosquitoes involved? How fast is it going to move? how badly are the horses and how the humans going to be affected. I wheeled around and had almost all of my non-immune, non-BHF immune team involved over the next 2 years working on that.
Using a live vaccine developed at Fort Detrick, Gerald Eddy, an Army vet assigned to Maru, made an important discovery.
It was a live vaccine designed to be used to protect the military troops against this virus in the event they ever had to get involved in combat operations in Latin America. And Jerry decided that he wanted to try this to see whether it would work and protect horses. He found a wealthy rancher in Costa Rica who had a herd of, 200-300 horses. He'd already had 10 of them involved with the disease, so Jerry knew that things were active there. And they immunized all the horses except 40 that the owner agreed to cut out and keep in a big corral so Jerry could bleed them every day. He immunized them. And he was able to show that in 72 hours, this live vaccine, even before you could measure antibodies against it, protected the horses from clinical disease with Venezuelan encephalitis virus. Nothing before ever done like that, nothing absolutely ever since.
Another piece of the VEE virus puzzle was discovered along Central American beaches, where mosquitoes were using crab holes to lay their eggs. The team soon determined that the crab hole mosquito was a significant vector of the disease.
That one summer, after we found out that the vaccine worked, the VE virus got to Mexico. It was going at a speed we could just plot it, and we figured it was going to reach Texas on the 4th of July. Had a big meeting with the people of USDA 3 months before that, told them they ought to start vaccinating the horses. And they said no, they were worried that the vaccine virus might revert to be virulent. Instead of protecting horses, they would cause an outbreak. So they wouldn't do anything about it.
While the Maru scientists grimly watched the disease's northward march, some members of the group let off steam by creating a tongue-in-cheek protest song entitled The Crab Hole Mosquito Blues.
Mosquitoes in his crab hole, biding his time, Venezuela virus working up the line.
What started off as an inside joke went very public when VEE finally reached Texas.
And we had a great big meeting in Washington, USDA and us and a whole bunch of people, Pan American Health Organization. I was supposed to give a discussion of a paper, and instead of that, why, everybody, both the people who spoke Spanish and English, had to listen to the crab hole mosquito blues.
Boys in Charlottesville heard the news. Horses in Texas got the crab hole blues.
And the punchline was that the boys in Beltsville, that's the headquarters of USDA, the boys in Beltsville got the news. Horses in Texas got the crab hole blues.
Then Johnson takes a break from crab hole mosquitoes and the tropical heat in Panama. He joins a scientific delegation and journeys to the Soviet Union because of another mystery hemorrhagic fever, this one found in Northeast Asia and Eastern Europe. Johnson's Russian hosts take the group to a city where the disease keeps recurring. There they learn about a man who got sick in December. The only clue? 10 days before, he ate raw vegetables stored underground.
And I said to myself, wow, he gets sick in December in the Soviet Union. The snow was on the ground, it was dead winter. It doesn't sound like any arthropod to me. Who might have contaminated the produce? It sounds like a rodent, okay, and I wonder, could we be dealing once again with a rodent-borne thing, chronic infection? Could it in fact even be an arenavirus? I really wanted to work on it, but I knew I couldn't do it in the Soviet Union, not in those days.
A solution comes from a U.S.-trained South Korean virologist named Ho-Wan Lee.
So the Army had a program then in supporting scientists in that part of the world, and so he was sent to me in Panama to sit down and discuss hemorrhagic fever and what to do about it. And the two of us got together and set up a protocol, and I told him I thought that the reason people couldn't recover this virus was that they kept going after it from the patients. And the patients clearly, didn't have virus that you could get at the time they were sick. And I wondered whether it could be an immunopathologic, an immune reaction disease. So I said to him, why don't we get sera from people who have had classical clinical cases and go out and start getting rodents and making thin frozen sections and putting the antiserum on, and then an antiserum to the antiserum with a fluorescent tag, and you use a special microscope and see if we could find this virus in the rodent. And that finally happened. And so Ho-Wan Lee and yours truly were the ones 25 years after the Korean War that finally fished out the first, what became Hantavirus, from one species of mouse in rural areas of South Korea.
After Ho-Wan Lee and Karl Johnson completed their seminal work, more researchers followed up with discoveries of other hantaviruses. Now a whole genus of them responsible for ongoing outbreaks in the southwest U.S. and South America is being studied. Historical footnote: as senior author, it was Ho-Wan Lee who gave this new virus its name.
We were, both of us now, river lovers. He named it Hantaan for a little river near the demilitarized zone, the 38th parallel, that flows in South Korea. The name translates in Korean to pleasant stream.
After Johnson's 13 years with Maru, winds of change are stirring in Washington. Richard Nixon, in his run for a second term, makes deep cuts in government spending. NIH is hit hard. Maru receives a fatal blow. But Johnson isn't out of work for long. Marburg, a deadly hemorrhagic fever whose natural reservoir remains unknown to this day, strikes in South Africa. 2 Australian tourists are infected. 1 dies. Dr. David Sensor, director of the CDC, believes that more events like this are bound to happen around the globe. Sensor offers Johnson the chance to found the branch of special pathogens. Johnson, joined by then-wife Patricia Webb, accepts the challenge.
That's how I got to CDC, moved there in '75. And once again, I tell you, I'm not sure how big the horseshoe is, but it doesn't fit in my back pocket.
The CDC move opened up a whole new set of colleagues, opportunities, as it turned out.
It did. I call them, in general, my CDC period was mainly my Africa period. I had had 13 years in Latin America, and now I was to have about 6 where the work was principally to be in Africa. We set up a field station in Sierra Leone to work on Lassa fever, a disease caused by another rodent-borne virus that's related to the Machupo one. I didn't discover Lassa, but our group, led by a young pediatrician and epidemiologist named Joe McCormick, did some marvelous work out there in the backside of Sierra Leone, characterizing the clinical disease, really working out the details of the relationship between the rodent and the humans in the villages in terms of transmission. And eventually, Joe did a clinical trial with an antiviral drug called ribavirin, and the subset of patients that had significant chemical liver damage had a 50% chance of dying, and he set up the study with ribavirin in that group and reduced the mortality from 50 to 5%. It was really quite an astounding thing. And even hardly before that operation got going, why the bell rang on what became Ebola.
I remember very well, I had just made the move to Tulane. It was the fall of 1976. And having come from CDC, I knew some of the people that were involved, or at least aware of what was going on in Zaire and Sudan. And I remember standing in front of a class, one of my first classes, telling them about what I knew and suggesting they hold their breath for 2 weeks because the world as we know it may not continue. Fortunately, and thanks to some of the things you learned, but take us to those early times with the outbreak and how you got involved.
We learned that there was an epidemic of hemorrhagic disease going on in two places. One was the southern Sudan, and at the same time in sort of northwestern Zaire, about 600 miles apart. And the thing about both of these outbreaks that was really disturbing was that not only were patients dying, but that the hospital staff was dying.
Samples obtained from victims reached special pathogens at CDC. Electron microscopic images revealed an organism that looked identical to Marburg. But immunological cross-studies performed by Patricia Webb showed there were differences. Later tests showed no match between the Sudan-Zaire samples and any other hemorrhagic fever virus on file at CDC. Once again, Johnson found himself face to face with a previously unknown pathogen that was breathtakingly lethal.
In the original Marburg outbreak in Germany, which happened because of infected monkeys that were brought in from Uganda, the mortality in that outbreak among the monkey handlers and even some of the hospital staff was about 23%. In Zaire, out in this mission, out of a total staff of Belgians and natives who had been trained of 17, 13 of them have become infected and 11 had died.
The situation could hardly have been more grim. A new virus, staggeringly contagious, almost always lethal. No clues as to where it comes from or how it moves from person to person. Karl Johnson and veteran epidemiologist Joel Bremen embark on a journey to the epicenter in Zaire with a small international team of fellow scientists. They face enormous challenges and an uncertain future. Once they establish their base near the mission hospital, Bremen, along with a young Belgian physician, Peter Piot, and several Zairean physicians, strike out on a survey mission in the bush.
It's tough going. I mean, you could drive maybe 15 miles an hour if you're lucky.
Assessment activities will commence seriously tomorrow. Over.
What he found was that there was still some disease out in the villages, but that the elders of the village were no longer willing to send people to the hospital. By then, there wasn't one anyway. They had decided that the disease was being spread in the hospital. So they did what they had done for forever against, say, smallpox. Each village isolated itself, put quarantine. Nobody can come in, nobody here can go out. If a patient gets sick, well, they put them in a small hut with food and water. And if the person survived, that was fine. They came out and good. And if they didn't, they lit a match, burned the hut, everything down. Well, Joel came back and said, it isn't clear which way this is going to go. It looks like maybe it's going to come under control, but boy, you know, we only were there for 5 days and we got so much to learn.
While you were there leading the team in Zaire, people here were still holding their breath because here, as you say, is the disease killing probably 95% of the infected people, no treatment, not known how it's transmitted. And I remember distinctly the meeting in Philadelphia in 1976, the bicentennial meeting for the U.S. You sent a tape which people pounced upon and gathered around to get the word, the latest word, from the source. Could you tell us a little about that?
We learned that somebody from the embassy was going back to Washington. And so Joel and I sat down and dictated where things stood in terms of what the whole situation was and what we were going to do and why. And we made a little tape, and then it finally got to Philadelphia, and yes, I was told that it played to a full house.
It played to a full house.
Clinical syndrome that we saw in the bush was described as beginning with a severe frontal and retroorbital headache radiating to the neck, lower back, and legs over 24 hours. Fever begins almost simultaneously. After 24 hours, we found severe abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting. About the third day, many patients began hematemesis and melena. By the fourth day, bleeding from the nose, ears, and vagina were seen. By day 5, the patients were prostrate and dehydrated. Death occurred between the 4th and the 10th day.
Up to this point, both the Sudan and Zaire outbreaks of fever have been limited to small villages. But events take a radical turn toward catastrophe when an infected nun from the mission dies of the disease in Zaire's largest city hospital, in the process infecting a nurse who cared for her.
The issue was at that point, and this gal had been, after the sister died, she'd been given time off, and she went all around town with contacts of extended family and this and that and talking about it all, and the question was how many people had she maybe exposed.
Kinshasa is a densely populated city. If the disease moves through the air, then a time bomb of hemorrhagic fever is about to explode. Ultimately, not a single case of the deadly fever is reported.
You know, it only was by osmosis that we finally decided that in fact that this disease had not been transmitted person to person by aerosol. The one patient that we saw did not have pulmonary signs or symptoms. The person was not coughing or sneezing at all. The other thing we discovered was that the generation of the outbreak was due more than anything to the fact that for whatever reason this mission hospital only used 2 or 3 syringes a day to give medicine to both people in a clinic in the morning and in the wards in the afternoon. They only boiled those doggone syringes once at the end of the day. And it's pretty clear that somebody probably came into the clinic, somebody we never saw, with lots and lots of virus in his blood and got an injection and took off, and that syringe then started infecting others.
Once again, Johnson had earned the hard-won privilege of naming the newly identified killer. Not surprisingly, he took his inspiration from a nearby waterway, the Ebola River.
Where do we stand today with Ebola?
Well, 2 places. Number one, we're still not sure where the heck in nature it lives. There's been a very, very recent scientific publications suggesting that perhaps certain fruit bats in the Congo River Basin could turn out to be reservoirs for this virus. Ebola is certainly one of the viruses that is considered to be a major, major risk in terms of use against us as a bioweapon. I think there's no doubt that the pace of scientific activity and research on Ebola and other agents just like it, Marburg absolutely included, the Lassa virus of West Africa and the other viruses of Latin America will definitely be not only increased but sustained.
All future work will stand on a foundation laid by Karl Johnson, his colleagues, and countless other workers in tropical medicine, past and present. For Johnson, it has been a career rich in meaning and experience.
When I look back and think about all of this, I had incredible opportunities to be involved in discovery of brand new viruses that caused very, very serious human disease, instead of sitting there frustrated in Bethesda, Maryland, trying to figure out how to get a common cold vaccine. And along the way, having a cultural education, a set of friends around the world that otherwise I would never have known, and Uncle Sam bought me all those tickets to go everywhere. No one absolutely could be more fortunate than I was.
It's also fortunate that the society and you found each other. You served as, I believe the records show that in the early 70s you served for 4 years as a counselor, as an officer. And what do you recall from that period?
What it did was, and on the council would be people in all of the major sort of disciplines, parasitologists, bacteriologists, virologists, and eventually people whose main interest was tropical clinical medicine. And that gave me a much broader sense of what the problems were, what the world was, and sometimes what people working in different areas had to offer to us in the virology. So the society was, for me, from the beginning, a constant ecological graduate course.
Your service on the council and other activities culminated, in a sense, with your election as president and your presidential address in 1984. And in fact, the society has never been quite the same since that address.
Well, I got sensitized during my years on the council. I began, in the meantime, to take a look at what was happening with other sister societies. I was a member of the Infectious Disease Society of America. I looked particularly at that, the American Society for Microbiology, and I saw that both of them had professional management and vibrant journals and ever-growing and powerful annual meetings. And I decided, hey, it's time that we either need to fish or cut bait or go home. That if we keep going the way we're going, we're going to get in real dire trouble. So I stood up and said it. And also that there were other research groups out there that we ought to cultivate to try and get in, like people working on diarrheal disease. This was in Baltimore, 1984. An awful lot of the elderly people thought that I was crazy. It apparently galvanized enough of the younger people to really get moving. And I think the society, happily, has grown and has just been transformed, not by me, but by the energy, the sustained energy of the people then who, in their turn, became leaders of it.
What are you doing now, Karl?
I thought I was retired. I've been trying to retire ever since I left government in 1985. But things keep happening. My wife Merle and I went back to Bolivia in 1993, 30 years after the recovery of the Machupo virus. And we had a tremendous celebration in the town. That town apparently will never forget the team of us. A beautiful sort of a thing. After that, Merle said to me, Karl, you got to put things together. I don't believe what you guys did in a place like this 30 years ago. You got to write it.
What kind of a plane is that?
That's a C-130. She and I have been working on and off then on a book to tell the story about the whole history of Machupo virus. It speaks to the stamina and the determination, I think, of people who live in very underserved parts of the rural world, whether or not it's the United States or it's in Latin America, Africa, or wherever. And we found those people to be the most patient, the most giving, the most positively fatalistic humans that I have ever met. And I have really enjoyed and learned an awful lot from living with and working with people under tremendous stress of that kind.
I really am incredibly proud knowing that I've been a member of a society which I think in its field is clearly the most international national society, the most important in the world in terms of tropical medicine and health. Thank you.